Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fabulous UQ community members and to the broader community who have joined us today. So we'd like to very quickly introduce our fabulous speaker for our session today. Initially, my name is Bec, welcoming you to the session. I'm one of the careers advisors in the MBA team, and I'm here to introduce our fabulous speaker for today. And our speaker is Professor Tim Kastelle, and he is the Director of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at UQ, Associate Professor of Innovation Management at the UQ Business School. Tim's research and teaching and engagement work are all based around his studies of innovation. He's graduated from Princeton Uni with a degree in economics, and his MBA and PhD were completed at the University of Queensland. He's worked in various roles, very diverse roles, which has brought him to the point of bringing his wealth of experience to you today. He's published widely in leading innovation journals, and he's deeply committed to translating research into practice, and has worked closely with the CSIRO to build the National Research Program, Commercialization Program on Prime. And he is here live with us today. Tim, I'll hand it over to you for today's session.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bec. So a couple of housekeeping things before I pull the slides up. So first thing is I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, which are going to be many different people since we're all over the place. But where I am, it's the Yagara and Turrbal people who've been custodians of this land for something in the neighborhood of 60,000 years plus. And so we'd like to acknowledge elders, past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge the contribution that they make, that group of people makes to Australia today. Just in terms of housekeeping, we're going to talk today about resilience and what's going on. To the extent that anybody knows, I don't, but we'll see what we can work out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about things that we can do at a personal level, and then also a little bit about things that we can do at an organizational level. And one other thing is we've got some time for questions at the end. If questions occur to you as we're going through this, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. If you click on that, Bec will be monitoring the questions, and then she can facilitate questions at the end of this session. So I think that's probably all we need to know to get started. So this is the topic, taking a long-term view during turbulent times. And I think the thing for me is, right, like I said, there's, okay, there. So we've got the acknowledgement of country. The other thing is I'd also like to acknowledge that right, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, right? And so not everyone's okay. And so some of you on the call right now may have lost your jobs. You might be worried about losing a job. You might have seen your revenue drop really substantially. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and I think it makes it a really hard time. And so I'm trying to frame this in a way that doesn't sound too flippant in referring to what's happening outside. And so I hope that you take things in that vein when, if it sounds like I'm being right, a little bit too cavalier about things. One thing that the business school has done in response to what's happening is we've taken some of our most popular online courses and made them available at the lowest possible price. So basically, there's an admin fee that we can't get out of with our partnership with edX, which is $8 Australian. If you follow this link, and we'll share the slides to everyone that registers later, you can follow this link and sign up to 3 of our really popular online courses, including one that I made a couple years ago on creativity and design thinking to support innovation. And so we're hopeful that this is something that will help people, you know, if you're in a place where you have both the time and the headspace to want to try to build your skills up a little bit. So I think, you know, one of the issues is when we're talking about short-term versus long-term, this I've taken from a talk by Jenny Odell, who I'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the things that I found myself doing at the start of the whole COVID-19 thing was, you know, every morning picking up my phone and just getting locked into an infinite scroll, right? And just going through geez, this piece of news is terrible and that piece of news is terrible, and just not knowing what's going on and actually not knowing really how to deal with what's happening. And so that was a really challenging thing. So one thing that I want to try to help us get around is just getting trapped into the froth of current events, because it can be really distracting. I think the second thing that I'm trying to watch out for is this. This is from a woman down in Melbourne named Fiona Tribe. Her Twitter stream is spectacular, and she had this tweet from about a week ago, right, where she says, where it's basically satire, where there's a lot of people saying, hey, you know, the post-coronavirus world is going to look like a world that cares exclusively about the thing that I happen to be good in. And I've seen many people have takes like that. And I'm trying to avoid that myself. It's one of the reasons why I've been fairly quiet about what's going on so far, because to some extent, a lot of this has been almost the world's biggest case of confirmation bias. Basically, everyone saying, hey, everything is going to be different, and so now we need X, with X being my personal thing. And so I think that's something to also be a little bit cautious about. Got really weird stuff going on with the slide, so sorry about that. So the first thing I want to talk about is, at a personal level, what happens if we extend our time horizon a little bit? And so we started with that acknowledgement of country. This piece on the screen now is a guidance in time. And this is the official UQ Reconciliation Action Plan artwork. And it was launched a year ago. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, because like I said, the Niagara and Turrbal people here in the Brisbane region have been custodians of this land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And every time people make a new archaeological discovery, that time frame extends even further back. It looks like it's 100,000 years, according to the latest research. And I've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years with innovators and others in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are working on using innovation and using science to promote development within their own communities. And I've learned a huge amount in doing that work. And one of the things that has been fascinating has been just seeing that perspective of, well, what happens when we take a 1,000-year perspective on what a business should be, rather than a quarterly perspective. So this is the exact opposite of picking up your phone every morning and getting caught in what's the latest tweet from President Trump. Right? So I think that 1,000-year view is a really useful way to sort of think about it. And it made me think about this framework that has come from Stewart Brand. So 20 years ago now, he wrote a book called The Clock of the Long Now. And he said, look, one of the problems that we're running into in the world is that we're too focused on short-term issues. We're too focused on that mobile phone stream, right? And we actually need to think about deeper things. And so he had this framework in the book where he said, actually, things are working, things happen at different paces. And so the analogy that he's using here is, if you think about a sphere, if you think about a ball that's rotating, the part in the middle moves much more slowly than the part on the outer rim. So as you're going around, the speed outside is much faster than the speed inside. And he said, if you think about this, we can actually think about different layers at which things evolve. The slowest core layer is that of nature. So that's the part that is pretty unchanging. And even though we're now in the Anthropocene and we're having a lot of impact on nature as humans, that's still a system that changes very slowly. It's actually one of the things that makes it really hard to come to grips with dealing with climate change, because we won't see the impact of actions that we take today for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years down the road. And that's not a time frame that we're used to working with, right? And then the next layer up is culture. So culture is basically the really ingrained ways that we act, right? And then there's governance, infrastructure, commerce, and fashion. And so there's a couple of things with this framework. One is that it's easy to say, well, don't pay any attention to the fashion layer at all. But one of the things that you get is that the faster layers, the outside layers, are the ones where all the new ideas happen, right? It's where innovation tends to occur most frequently. And the idea is that new ideas pop up in the faster layers, and then it's basically the slower layers that filter. It's the slower layers that say, yep, this is what's going on. That's an important idea. And we'll embed that into governance or culture, or one of the deeper, slower layers. So these are some of the things that Brand says about it, right? He said, right, they're functionally different. The interesting bit is at the intersection. And by having different layers that move at different paces, that's actually how we build systems resilience, right? And so the thing that he says is that learning happens out in the fast layers, but remembering happens in the slow layers, right? And fast is the one that says, here's a new idea. And it's the slow layers that say, that's not a very good one, right? And so, and then ultimately, that last point that I've bolded is the really critical one. Fast gets all of our attention, slow has all of the power. And I think that this is a really, for me, this has been a really useful thing tool for thinking about what's happening right now, because if I think about it through this lens, it helps me realize that those slower layers are still there. The day-to-day stuff that's taking our attention right now will continue to be important. And there are some urgent things that we have to take care of. If we don't have food and shelter and all the rest of it, we have to act quite urgently. But at the same time, those slower layers persist. And by thinking about the slower layers that are still there and still important and will still be there 12 months from now, five years from now, 10 years from now, 1,000 years from now, at a personal level, it's really helped me kind of reorient my attention in a way that has been really useful. So whenever I find myself getting too frantic about what's going on the fresh horror machine, it's helpful for me to go back outside and just connect with nature a little bit, or to just think about, well, what's really going to persist out of all of this? How are we going to come out of this? And what might look different? And I think one of the things that people have pointed out is that, you know, I've used this diagram in some of my talks for a while now, right? And so this is demonstrating actually that difference between the different pace layers. So technology is on one of those outer fast layers, right? And so technology changes really quickly, but our institutions, management and the way we approach things and governance and culture, they change much more slowly. And this actually makes a lot of sense. If you think about something like fintech, you don't want our legal structure around financial management to change every time a new fintech startup starts, right? We can't respond to every single change out on the fast layer. We actually need to have some churn there so that we can actually figure out, well, which of those ideas are important. And so the thing that we get is we get this governance gap over a period of time because ideas evolve much more rapidly than institutions do, right? And so that to me is what actually comes from this pace layer idea, is that difference in evolutionary pace between ideas at the outer side, institutions at the inner side, and thinking about how they connect up, I think is really important. So there's two ways that I think about this. So two of the best books that I read last year, I think bear on this exact issue. One is this one by Jenny Odell, who I mentioned earlier. So it's called How to Do Nothing. And basically this is her formula for disconnecting from the fast layer out at fashion or commerce and reconnecting down at the slower central layers. And it's a beautiful book. She's written really well around the value of doing that, a set of tools for doing that more effectively. And the argument that she makes is that if we connect more meaningfully with our place, that helps us be more grounded. It helps us be more connected to those slower, more important layers in a pace layer hierarchy, right? And it helps us adapt more to what's going on in the modern world. So I think that's one really useful way to think about things. And then the other really good book that I wrote is by Tyson Yunkaporta. He wrote this book. He does a podcast with my friend Ellie Rennie called Disconnect, which talks about the intersection between Australian Aboriginal knowledge and Western knowledge, and the impact that technology is having, especially out on country, in the small communities that are a little bit disconnected from the center. This book is a really good example of how to take the 1,000-year view and apply that to problems and issues that seem incredibly urgent today. So he thinks about, well, what's going on with climate change? What happens if we view that through the lens of Indigenous knowledge? What happens if we think about social media through that same lens? And he just goes through, what happens if we think about personal relationships? What happens if we think about men and women, right? And really good book, and another useful tool for helping us reorient to those slower layers. So to just summarize around what's going on at the personal level, right, I think there's a couple of things that we can conclude. One is that when we have a system like this, systems that work at different layers, right, it's one way to actually build resilience in, because it allows you to consider, test, and discard a lot of different ideas out at the fast layer, and only take into the slower layers the ones that prove valuable and the ones that seem to work. Right? And then changes in the slower layers always come from innovation at the layers above, right? So cultural change comes when we have innovation in fashion, commerce, infrastructure, and governance, right? And then I think the one kind of exception to that is nature. Nature doesn't change as much as we kind of tend to think it does. Nature is more the thing that we have to calibrate everything else against. Right, and we're seeing that right now. This is it's a fascinating time, because we're at a point where basically every government and every society in the world is facing the same test at the same time, which is a little bit of nature saying, you need to keep this kind of stuff in mind. And so I think that intersection between layers is really interesting. Like I said, one recommendation, and I think the two books that I recommended give us some tools for thinking about ways to stop paying as much attention to those outer layers and reorienting to the slower ones. And like I said, for me, that's really been helpful in getting through, reasonably tough times. And in saying that, I'm incredibly privileged in that regard. So I know that many people have had much tougher times than I have, and I'm struggling. So, I think a lot of us need to be thinking about, well, how do we just slow things down and move down to those slower layers to think about what's going on down there. And then the last thing is that our time horizons are just too short. Right? In general, if we think about management, if we think about business, if we think about publicly held companies, thinking about things on 3-month cycles, it doesn't work if we're trying to build long-term thriving and long-term success. So I think that idea of thinking across longer timeframes is an important one. So that's the personal level. So then what do we do at the organizational level? Right, and one thing here is that I've had a handful of companies get in touch with me over the last couple of weeks saying, we're really struggling right now. We realize that we need to do something differently. What recommendations do you have? And for a lot of these organizations, there's no real good answer to that, right? Because one of the things that we have to do is we actually have to build our capabilities for innovating and for trying new things during periods of time when things are a little bit less turbulent, right? And so here's an analogy that I find really useful. It's the first time I've spoken about it in public, so this may or may not work, but we'll give it a try. So on the left, this is, for a long time, biologists and paleontologists had a mystery. When they looked at the fossil record stretching back millions and millions of years, the expectation was that we would see evolutionary change happen on a consistent pace, that over time, the amount of change would be similar. And so that's why people were looking for things like missing links, because if change happens at a consistent pace, there should be always, in between species 1 and species 2, some intermediate step that's really obvious. And so about 40 years ago, two paleontologists, Stephen Jay Gould, who you might have heard of, and Niles Eldredge, actually studied the paleontological record in more detail. And what they realized is evolution doesn't happen along a smooth line. Evolution happens in jumps. So what happens is we actually have long periods where there's a stable environment, and then and in that period of time, there's very little change. So things look consistent and they look stable. And then something happens in the environment. It can be an asteroid strike. It can be a change in temperature. It can be a change in the makeup of the species that you're interacting with. There's a bunch of things that can happen in the environment. When that changes, we then get really rapid change in terms of evolution. And so if you look at the fossil record, those missing links should actually come in those big jumps. And the reason that we don't see a lot of missing links in the fossil record is those big jumps happen really fast if we're looking at geological time, right? I think this is a really good analogy for the way change happens in business and organizations as well, because we get the same pattern. Anyone, if you're an MBA alumni and you've taken the innovation course with us, you'll probably remember the S curve of innovation diffusion, which looks exactly like these curves. And it's the same kind of thing that's happening. We actually have a very slow uptake of a new idea, then it happens that it gets adopted really quickly, and we have a period of stability. And so this leads to a number of issues that we run into from a management standpoint, right? So the first one is, if we think about how do we test new ideas, right? The normal way that big existing companies do that is they do something like a net present value calculation. And the idea there is you say, well, we've got our cash flow. That's what we're going to have if we do nothing. If we test out this new idea, we'll lose some money at the start, and then eventually it'll take off and we'll make a bunch of money. And if we calculate the difference between what we lose before it takes off and what we'll make after people decide it's a good idea, if the net present value of that difference is positive, then we can implement that idea. If it's negative, we say we won't do it. This makes sense in a stable environment. In a stable environment, you can pretty much make this calculation. But there's a few assumptions that go into this. One is that we can actually calculate those numbers in a meaningful way. If we're talking about something that's genuinely innovative, we actually can't calculate those numbers in a meaningful way. So Cameron Turner, who some of you have been hearing from recently in this whole series of talks that he's doing, he did a TEDx UQ talk recently, and he made the point that, like the Segway, when people launched that seemed like a really good idea. If you did an MPV calculation and you believed the sales projections, it totally made sense. But because it was completely new, we actually couldn't make realistic calculations about what the return on that idea was going to be. And that's why it ultimately ended up failing. The other assumption, though, in the MPV version of figuring out whether or not the idea is worth trying, and this comes from a paper that Clay Christensen did with a couple of collaborators in Harvard Business Review over 10 years ago now. The reference is there at the bottom. But here's the killer assumption in all of this. The killer assumption is, if we don't try the new idea, the baseline stays the same. But if we're in an evolving environment, which we really clearly are right now, and which I would argue we need to be planning for all the time, if we're in an evolving environment, the baseline case is not everything stays the same, right? What happens is, if you say, we're not going to try those new ideas, and you do that with every new idea that comes up, your baseline case actually deteriorates. It gets worse, right? And so the assumption that everything will just be the same as it always is forever is one of the most dangerous assumptions that a business can possibly make, right? And so I think the thing here, and I talked about this in a blog post where I said, people talk about having a risk-averse culture, and so they don't try new ideas because they have a risk-averse culture. And the problem is, if you have a risk-averse culture and you don't try new ideas, you increase the probability that your baseline is going to follow that red line of deterioration rather than the stable line or a growth line, right? And so we reduce short-term risk by not trying new ideas, and it actually increases the risk of catastrophic failure. And we've seen a little bit of that in the current situation, right? And so this slide just reiterates that point that I just made, right? If the baseline is likely to deteriorate, we have to take short-term risks, and we probably have to take short-term risks that don't make sense from a net present value perspective. And so this, I think, this is another tool that I found useful in thinking about this. This is the Cynefin network. It's a Welsh word, despite the fact that it looks like a real word. It's Welsh. And it's a framework developed by a guy named Dave Snowden. There's a very good HBR article that he wrote about it, and I put at the bottom a really nice video that he made with a number of his collaborators a week ago that just talks about how this applies and how these ideas of complexity apply in what's going on today. And I'm not, look, you can do a full 12-week course on this online and not exhaust the topic. So I can't really explain it in full detail in 3 minutes. But the critical point, and the reason that I put this here, is that let's just compare simple and complex. If we think about simple, that's what you do in a stable environment. That's where best practice actually works. If you're in a simple environment where things aren't changing, the environment's stable, and you don't have a whole lot of threats to consider, then the thing that you do is you sense, categorize, and respond. So you say, let's look at what's going on out in the world. That's the sensing part. And then we say, okay, this is a strategy problem. So we categorize it and say it's a strategy problem. Consequently, our response will be, we'll use the 5 forces analysis, right? That works fine when things are stable. But when things are complex, that actually doesn't work, right? Because you actually can't categorize, and best practice doesn't exist. What you're looking for is emergent practice. And so in that situation, the thing that you do is you probe. You actually send out a test. You do a small experiment, and you try to figure out, did it work in the way I expected it to? And if it does, then our response is we scale it up. If it doesn't work in the way that we expect it to, our response is, well, let's learn from that and move on to the next thing. So that's what you do in a complex environment. You can make an argument that what we're in right now, in a lot of instances, is chaos. And chaos requires, right, you can't just probe. There you have to act, right? You actually have to do something and just take a stance, see if it worked, and then go on. And so I think the thing here is that bit in the middle is also really important. So disorder is what happens when the situation is changing. And so the critical thing in disorder is just trying to figure out which of these 4 domains are we in, or which of these 4 domains are we going to emerge into, right? And so a lot of what's happening right now is we're still in disorder. And a lot of people, if we see governments or businesses saying, it's time that we have to get back to normal, what they're trying to do is they're trying to force us from disorder back into simple, right? They're trying to say, get back into simple so that we can just do the things that we know work, right? And that's really dangerous when it's highly likely that where we are is actually the complex domain, or even worse, chaos. I thought that the best example of what to do in chaos is this video that probably some of you have seen. It's from Mike Ryan, who led the World Health Organization response to the Ebola crisis. And a couple of weeks ago, he was at a press conference, and one of the questions from the press was, what can we learn from the Ebola crisis? And I've included the link. It's really worth watching. He has this 2-minute answer, which is the perfect encapsulation of this is what we do when we face chaos, right? And the thing that he said is you have to act. Right? When things are going nuts, you just have to act. Speed is more important than getting it right. If you wait until you know for sure that what you're going to try to work will work, then you fail, right? And so if you're waiting to be right before you move, then you're just flat out dead. So I think it's a really good clip that's worth taking a look at. So from an organizational standpoint, right, I think the thing here is that in business, we often like to believe that we're operating in a stable environment. But the fact of the matter is we pretty much aren't, right? And so if we're in a stable environment, optimizing for efficiency and using best practice is the exact correct way to respond. If we happen to not be in a stable environment, though, optimizing for efficiency will actually kill you. So we actually need to be really aware of what's going on outside. And in general, and some of you have heard this from me before, assuming that things are stable is one of the most dangerous assumptions you can possibly make in business. And something I think we need to be cautious about. When things are turbulent, we need to be more in that probe, sense, respond, or act, sense, respond mode, where we actually test stuff and figure out what is going to happen. Both of those approaches are things that create novelty, right? And when we're in complexity or chaos, that's what we need. We need novelty. We need innovation, because that's where emergent practice, new emergent practice comes from. So the critical thing in all of this is actually building this capability while things are stable, so that when things go nuts, we're ready for it, right? It's not the most actionable thing I can tell you right now, but it's basically the thing to be thinking about, is that next time things seem a little bit stable, let's actually start just increasing the amount of uncertainty and chaos that we're facing, because that will help us get ready for what's going on. The great example of that is Netflix. They have a thing that they call the chaos monkey, right? So with Netflix, to have streaming services, the thing that you need stable servers. The chaos monkey goes around and randomly shuts down servers in the Netflix server environment. And the whole point of it is to figure out, can the system respond? And it actually helps them highlight weak points in the system while they're at a point in stability. And so I think one of the things to be thinking about, I should have made a whole slide about it, is what's our version of a chaos monkey? So it turns out that Fiona was right. Right? So the thing that I'm saying is, post-corona workplaces, the thing that we need is innovation. So hopefully this will give you at least a few ideas about how you can start adapting to what's going on outside right now. And the last thing I just want to close on is this quote from Charles Eames that came up through my Instagram feed a couple days ago, right? Where he said, look, it's important to remember that the best you can do between now and Tuesday is still a kind of the best you can do. And I think it's also important for all of us to remember that the best you can do in a global pandemic is also a kind of best you can do. And it's important to hold to that, because right, the other thing is to just be kind to ourselves as we're trying to adapt to an environment that none of us are prepared for in a lot of respects, and where we don't know what's going to happen. So just, let's just keep doing the best we can do. There's more, as always, at my blog, and you can go look at it there. And then the last thing before we go to questions is that, right, the majority of the people here are probably affiliated with the MBA one way or another. But for those of you that haven't been involved with UQ MBA, if any of this has been interesting and you want to start building these skills for yourself, and you want to do more than those free courses that we talked about at the start, we've got an info evening for the MBA itself tomorrow afternoon, and then another one on the 20th of May. And you can check that out at the Business School website. So I think that brings us to questions.
Wonderful, Tim. Thank you. We've just got our first question from Jared Silverman. Jared said, are there ways to design institutions to allow exponential change when desired?
That's it. Hey, first off, hi, Jared. I haven't actually seen Jared for 30 plus years, so it's great that he actually came in for this. Look, I mean, it's a tough question, because so there's an idea in the business management literature. It's the worst management phrase ever. It's called absorptive capacity. And the idea with absorptive capacity is that at an organizational level, if you aren't actively trying to change all the time, you can't change on demand, right? And so that's another way of restating the argument that I just made, which is, right, prepare for that exponential change when it seems like you don't have to. So actively try to do new things and build in that capacity, so that when you actually do need to move, you have it built in. And so we've seen that, a lot of the organizations that are doing really well right now, they're either one of two categories. One is they're already a monopoly and enormous, and they're just unstoppable. And you can think of the examples there. The other example is the organizations that are already agile, right? So the ones that have entered the crisis with agility have been able to respond to it with agility, but you can't build it on the fly, right? You actually have to build it in advance. And so that's probably, it's not a great answer. It's a really complex question, but it's probably about the best I can do right now.
Now we have a next up question from Jill Penridge. Executive management is often orientated towards fulfilling the needs of their own personal promotion cycles, which tend to align with an annual timeframe. Organizational culture is orientated to decadal timeframes. It'd be great to hear from you about the practical methods to influence senior executives for the benefit of an organization in the longer term.
Yeah, so first off, it's great that it's all my friends asking questions, but so hi to Jill as well. So look, another really good question. And I think the challenge that we have here is that you're exactly right. And so if I go deeply into a dark corner that I generally try to avoid, one of the things that I wonder sometimes is, can organizations actually change, right? If the answer to that is no, then the answer to your question is find an organization that has a longer term view and go work with them, right? So part of it is, so one thing that we have is we do have a level of agency. It's reduced under circumstances like we have right now, but we generally have a level of agency that allows us to select a little bit about the environment that we're going to work in. And so if it's really hard for organizations to change, and there's some evidence that it is, one thing is to just find a different one. But the more hopeful thing is that organizations can change, right? And the first thing to do is to basically influence the area that you're in. Right. And so talk with your immediate managers, talk with the people that report to you, and work out within our little domain, how can we take that longer term view? Right. And in general, what happens if you start to do that, you start to get better outcomes. Right. And if the organization is well managed, they'll pay attention to that, and then the idea can start to spread. So there actually is power in it's not the best phrase, but bottom up organizing, where we basically have ideas that come from layers in the organization that we don't traditionally look to for new ideas. And I strongly encourage everyone to do what you can within the span of control that you currently have.
And we've heard from Jamie, who says a big hi. And further to the question that you've just answered, Tim, how do we nurture the slower parts of our society, when things move so quickly? Go slow or fast is the question.
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple of things. One is that we, first off, have to be aware of them, because a lot of people aren't. And so part of this is just thinking deliberately about, as things are changing, as we respond to COVID-19, as we respond to changes in the economy, who's getting left behind, right? So who is moving more slowly than change, and what can we do to take care of them? And part of that is just a deliberate practice. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to raise this as an issue, is to try to get more of us thinking about this deliberately, so that we can start collectively thinking about how do we get this addressed, right? So that's part of it, right? And the second part is, I think, being mindful about our roles as people at some of those intersections, right? Because we have opportunities as people to move things up and down, right? And to actually, take some of those changes that are happening out in the faster layers and embed them again in the layers that we've got some control over. And so the idea is, if we do that within our little layer, that might influence the organizational cultural layer that's the next layer down, right? And so it's a combination of that managing up, managing down. You're muted, Bec. Muted. Bec, you were muted. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, guys. We've got a question from Ellie or Duff. How do we build value chains that are simultaneously cost-effective and resilient, balancing profit versus sovereign risk? And just one more point for participants. We've probably got one or two more questions that Tim has time for. So if you'd just like to look at your bottom bar at the Q&A place, please drop a couple of questions there and we'll be able to answer that as we wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
And let's also just make sure that we capture the chat. And I might be able to pick up some of those in a blog post soon as well. So if there's burning questions that we haven't hit, we'll figure out another way to try to get to them. So look, I think the challenge here is that we always think about these things as trade-offs. So we think about, well, can we be sustainable over the long term, or can we be profitable in the short term? The research on this is overwhelming, and the research says that the most successful companies generally tend to be both. So it's not an either or trade-off, it's a both and. And so one of the things, one of my favorite organizations in the world right now is called SheEO. And it's an organization that it's a venture capital organization that collects really small amounts of grants from women and then directs it towards women founders. And the one condition that they have, if you want to pitch for a SheEO grant, is that you have to address one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things that's interesting is this program has been running for about 5 years now. And if you look at both the percentage of startups that they've funded that have been successful and that have persisted, and if you look at the return, they're vastly outperforming almost any other venture capital fund that was founded at the same time, so in the same cohort. And so and that's just one example of actually saying we need not only to be a successful business, but we need to contribute to addressing one of the Sustainable Development Goals. By doing both of those things, you actually build a more effective business. And Bec mentioned at the start, I've been doing a lot of work on research commercialization with the CSIRO and others around Australia. One of the things that's been really fascinating with that work is that when you think about those multiple sets of stakeholders, you actually build stronger, more resilient business models than if you just optimize for profit coming from one set of stakeholders. So it sounds harder, it sounds impossible in some respects, but it actually gets you better outcomes if you do that design work up front.
We've got a question from Jackie Walters. Do you think that organizations can adapt methods typically used for innovation and growth to address post-COVID reforms and manage the associated risk of those reforms? Is this a way to make faster, slower layers make sense to risk-averse executives? And also, why wasn't your drawing yellow?
See, this is what happens when your friends tune in. So hi, Jackie. So the drawings weren't yellow because I actually have two colors of cards. And so when I'm presenting to CEOs, I use the blue ones. And when I'm presenting to everyone else, I use the yellow ones. So that's the really short answer to that. So look, it's a really good question. And I believe that the answer is yes, these approaches can help us make that case more strongly, because if you're a CEO or a board member right now and you don't realize that things are a lot more fragile than you thought they were, you're not going to be in business for a whole lot longer. And so there's a window of attention and a window of intention that have opened up right now, And I think we do have an opportunity to try to sneak in that window to try to change practice a little bit. This is why I used that quote from Fiona Tribe at the start, because we still don't know what's going to happen, right? We don't know if there's a second wave coming. We're relaxing restrictions right now. We hope that that's going to work. No one actually knows. And so, 12 months from now, I could say, yep, let's go for it. Now's the time to act. And we could hit 12 months and we've had this huge second wave and we say, geez, then wasn't the time to act, right? So I think we have to use some discretion and do small scale experiments. But the one thing I would be doing is reaching out to people in the network, in our networks that are struggling a little bit, that might want to try something different, and just figuring out what's a small scale test we can run. And if it fails, we don't mind losing that small investment. But if it works, we've learned something really important. That's what Dave Snowden calls safe fail experiments, right? And it's really similar to the idea from effectuation of affordable losses, where you say, what's an amount we're willing to invest to learn about what may or may not work? I think that's a really smart move to be making right now. So thanks everyone for the attention and the questions. I hope it was useful, and I'll throw back to Bec now to wrap it up.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And Amin and Steve, thanks for your questions, and we'll pass them on to Tim to see if he can answer them on his blog. Thanks everyone for joining us, from our own MBA students, from our UQ students and our community beyond. And you'll be directed now to the UQ Business homepage, and some of those slides that Tim put up earlier on the subsidized programs and on the MBA webinar that's coming up this Thursday will be there. So if you'd like to pop along and join us in a session coming up soon, we'd love to see you. Thanks again for your time today.